Welcome to the Weekly Dose by Augusta Global Insights. This is a summary of one of our latest reports, where we're digging into the biggest developments shaping business, markets, and the whole global economy. If you want to dive even deeper and read the full article, the link for that is waiting for you down in the description.
All right, let's get right into it. You hear it everywhere, right? In the headlines, on the news. The U.S. economy is booming. But is that really the whole picture? Our latest report suggests there's a lot more happening just under the surface. And honestly, it's a story you're going to want to hear.
So, this week's data, it's kind of like a tale of two completely different stories. In one corner, you've got the popular narrative about the U.S. economy. And in the other corner, you have this really powerful and totally different story playing out across global markets.
You know, if you just glance at the headlines, everything seems pretty stable in the U.S. I mean, the market's been hanging out near all-time highs. But the second you start peeling back the layers on the actual economic data, the numbers that really affect everyday folks, a very different picture starts to take shape. And it's one that's full of some pretty big warning signs.
Okay, so let's actually dig in and build the case against that whole booming economy idea. We're going to look at three key pieces of data that, frankly, challenge the official story head-on.
And what's really fascinating here is where these cracks are showing up. We're seeing them in three very different but totally connected parts of the economy. We're talking jobs, consumer debt, and commercial real estate. So yeah, let's get into the actual numbers. First up, the job market. Okay, get this. The Bureau of Labor Statistics just made a huge, and I mean huge, downward revision to one of its recent benchmarks. We're talking about them essentially wiping almost 900,000 jobs right off the record. That is a staggering number, and it completely flips the script on the whole job growth story.
All right, next up is consumer debt. U.S. credit card debt just hit a mind-blowing, record-breaking $1.25 trillion. That is just, wow. It really shows the immense pressure that regular consumers are under. People are relying on credit just to get by, especially as their actual purchasing power gets squeezed. And all that stress, it's spilling over into another really critical area. The delinquency rate for commercial real estate mortgages just hit 11.7%. To put that in perspective, that's the highest level ever in history. That's a major red flag, signaling some serious trouble for what's supposed to be a cornerstone of the economy.
This quote from Fortune magazine it really puts a fine point on it. The story we all heard was that the U.S. economy created 500,000 jobs last year. But the reality? It was just 181,000. That is a massive, massive gap between the narrative we were sold and what was actually going on. Okay, so now let's pivot a little bit. We're going to shift away from the U.S. story and look at a really powerful trend that's happening all across the globe. Because while the U.S. data is showing all these signs of strain, another part of the world is going through what our report calls a renaissance. Now, to really get what's happening here, we need to be on the same page about what an emerging market actually is. Basically, think of a country that's making a big shift, moving from an economy based on agriculture to one based on industry. Now, they've got massive potential for growth, but there's also higher risk involved. And right now, that potential is absolutely on full display.
I mean, just look at this comparison. The U.S. S&P 500, it's up about 13% over the past year, which is, it's solid, right? But now look at South Korea, up over 142%. Or how about Peru, up over 107%? I mean, come on. These returns are on a completely different planet, and it really highlights this dramatic global shift in performance that's happening. So here we are. We've got these two totally different stories playing out. On one side, a struggling U.S. real economy. On the other, these booming emerging markets. So what happens when you put these two pieces of the puzzle together? And maybe more importantly, what does it all mean for you?
Well, what it does is it highlights one of the most important lessons in all of finance. The stock market is not the real economy. They can be two completely different beasts. The U.S. market, for example, has been floating near all-time highs, right? It's been fueled by things like AI hype, sky-high expectations, that kind of stuff. But the real economy, the one we measure with jobs and debt, is telling a totally different story.
Now, whenever you see a big gap like this open up, a gap between the market hype and the cold, hard economic reality, our report points out that investors often start looking for safety. They start seeking out tangible value. And that's exactly why you see hard assets like gold and silver come into the conversation as a potential hedge against all this uncertainty. Okay, I know that was a lot of data to throw at you, so let's boil this all down. What are the most important takeaways from this week's analysis? The real bottom line. All right, here's what you really need to remember. First, that whole booming U.S. economy story, it's on some pretty shaky ground when you actually look at the data. Second, don't ever confuse the stock market with the real economy. They can and often do tell two very different stories. Third, some emerging markets are posting absolutely explosive growth. And finally, all this means that having a true global perspective on things is more crucial now than ever before. And that really brings us to our final big question to think about. We've seen the data, we've seen the major disconnect. So as this gap between all the market hype and the actual economic reality just keeps getting wider, it really forces all of us to ask a tough question. Where is the real, sustainable growth going to come from in the years ahead? Thanks so much for checking out this summary of our report. And remember, if you want the full, in-depth analysis from Augusta Global Insights, the link to the original article is right there for you in the description below.